Well, I'm glad that everybody decided to stay and come back, and I didn't chase you off too bad this morning. Hopefully, you guys have had a good day. We've enjoyed the day. Enjoyed having some visitors with us today. Thankful that you guys are able to be here. The Lord is blessed, and we were joking a little bit in between services about not having the golf balls bouncing off the wall, but that is a prayer. That is an answered prayer. We make light of it, and honestly, we were willing to have services even despite that, right? Because we didn't want anything to distract us from Him. But the Lord answered our prayer on that, and very thankful for it. Because if you were here on those days where those balls were bouncing off the wall, there were days it was a little intense. But we kept doing what we were supposed to do, kept coming, kept having services, and the Lord blessed. So just a prayer of thanksgiving, really, I guess, as we think back on those times. It's easy sometimes, when you're going through it, it's always there and it's a big deal. And then when it's gone, it's kind of funny how quick we forget what we were going through before the Lord changed things. So it's always good to remember. Okay, we are going to be back in Matthew chapter 23. We, of course, kind of left off in the middle of some thoughts here. In Matthew chapter 23, the Lord is talking to the multitudes and to the disciples and warning them about the Pharisees. And, of course, he starts by saying, hey, look, some of their message and some of the things they're preaching out of, teaching out of, not a bad thing. But their heart's wrong, their motive is wrong, and when no one's looking, they're wrong. And he talked a lot about how that their real motive was that they wanted recognition. They wanted to be seen of men. They wanted to be called rabbi as they walked through the marketplace. They wanted to have the chief seats at the feasts and to be in the chief places in the synagogues. And so we talked this morning about that and how that what God's plan for us instead is that we are supposed to seek to be servants. We're supposed to seek to be ministers to each other. We're told in multiple places that, we're not supposed to be like those others. We're not supposed to be like the world. We're not supposed to be like the nation, the Gentile nations, where it's all about fighting to be top dog, right? That's not what He has planned for us. That's not what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be humble and have servants' attitudes. And so that's kind of what we covered this morning. And then as we kind of got started here in verse 13, we talked about a few of these things. We'll recap a little bit. It says, "But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in." We talked about how that when you look at their attitude toward John the Baptist's message, when you look at their attitude toward Jesus' message, it wasn't just that they didn't buy into it. Man, they were actively pursuing to convince everybody else to not buy into it. We talked a little bit in verse 14. "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses for a pretense, make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation." These guys that were supposedly great religious guys talking about the law of Moses and the things of God and being righteous, yet give them a chance and they would defraud a widow and try to seem religious while they're doing it. Verse 15, we talked, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves." They would go out and seek people to convert, and yet when they converted them and convinced them that they were now okay with God, they're worse off than they were before because they think they're okay. I think that's part of it. He goes on, says in verse 16, and this is kind of where we were stopped this morning, "Woe unto you, blind guides, which say, Whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it and by all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God and by him that sitteth thereon. You look at these passages, and again, I think there's a couple different things that you can take away from this. I am actually reminded of the Lord's own teachings in other places where he says, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Just say yes or say no. Do it or don't do it. This whole thing about I'm going to swear on this or I'm going to swear on that, just don't. Right? Just don't. And yet here we find that the Pharisees seem to have taught that, well, you're okay if you swear on the temple, but don't swear on the gold of the temple. And the Lord comes along and says, wait a minute. The temple is just something that is or the gold is just something that's in the temple, or it covers certain aspects of the temple. How can you think that it's okay to swear on that but not swear on the temple? I mean, after all, isn't it the temple that actually makes the gold special? I mean, we think about gold being special, right? But when you think about the temple, I mean, that was the place that God dwelt among them. He said, it's not the gold, man, it's the temple. He called them blind. You know, he is attacking their I'm going to tell it this way. He is calling out their false teaching. And he actually tells them, you are blind guides. You think you are coming along and leading the blind. In reality, you are just a blind person leading a blind person. There's another place that talks about you're going to go in a ditch. Listen, these people had false teachings. We need to make sure that we are studying this Word of God faithfully, consistently, and that we get up here or in Sunday school class or when we're visiting with our friends or we're talking about different Bible things to people, we want to be true to His Word. I don't want to be a stumbling block for somebody else. I don't want to be somebody that's just like the blind guy leading another blind guy, and we're about to walk off in the ditch. The Pharisees were blind. He goes on, and he just not talks about the gold itself either in verse 18. And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. So in other words, it's this idea that, you know what, when you look at the altar in the temple, you know, that's not a big deal. But if you swear on the sacrifice or the offering that's on the altar, that's a big deal. And the Lord comes along and says, well, wait a minute. Like, the altar is what these things are sacrificed on. It's there. The offering comes, goes. But this is the thing that all those things are offered upon. You can't say that it's nothing to swear upon the altar. Matter of fact, when you swear upon the altar, you're swearing upon everything that goes across that altar. It's that same concept. He goes on, and he says, ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it and by all things thereon. And whosoever shall swear by the temple sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. He's actually, I think, backing up to the beginning where he talked about whether you should swear in the temple or you should swear in the gold. And you said, hey, it's the temple that sanctifies the gold. But now he's coming back to that and saying, well, let's just clarify that a little bit more. You swear on the temple, you're actually swearing on the God of the temple. It's a big deal. Who shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. Listen, the Pharisees seem to have been coming along and saying, hey, if you swear by the temple, that's no big deal. Jesus says, you swear by the temple, you're swearing on the God that dwells therein. And while we're talking about that, and he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. While we're speaking of this, we shouldn't be swearing on heaven either. You swear on heaven, you're swearing on the God that dwells there. So he has taken them, and in this passage, he has said, they're hypocrites, they're arrogant, they're lifted up in pride, they have all the wrong motives, they don't do the things they tell everybody else that they should do. Oh, and by the way, their teachings are wrong too. All those things they tell you it's okay to do, but not to do this. Let's just back up and think about this for a little bit. And he tears apart some of their teachings. And now we're going to be down to another woe in verse 23. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. You know, this is an interesting passage here as you look at this. This whole thing about swearing or tithing on mint and cumin, anise and cumin, if I understand it right, that I'm probably saying it wrong, but that middle herb there is what we would call dill. But these are basically really, really small items, right? I think the point here is these are herbs that, like, little bitty things. Like, people, honestly, they probably wouldn't even think to count out a tenth of that. Hey, listen, Pharisee, you think about the things that other people might have just passed over, and you take this little pile of spices and herbs, and you're cutting out a tenth for God. In other words, man, down to the finest detail, you're trying to get it right. But you are not merciful, faithful, and you've lost judgment. Now, as we think about these three for a minute, it uses the word judgment. And the word judgment can mean different things. We think of it sometimes like we would look at this and go, well, actually, I think the Pharisees were really good at judgment. I mean, isn't that part of what he's talking about? They're condescending and they think they've got it and nobody else does, and they're going to hold everybody else to a super high standard and really berate them when they don't. I mean, actually, the Pharisees are really good judges. Well, that's not what this is meaning. The word here is actually talking about justice. They have lost a sense of justice. Right and wrong, righteous judgment. They've lost it. And mercy, compassion, they have none. The very fact that they would tithe of mint and cumin and yet devour a widow's house. The very fact that you'd see that Pharisee stand in the temple and declare that he's glad that he's not like this lowly publican over here. Right? No compassion. No mercy. I think we would say today, hard-hearted, maybe? Calloused? Cold? Right? You know, this is one that I think we have to really, really be careful about. And I pick on Baptist because I, as the saying goes, I am one. if we're not really careful, we can get so wrapped up in dotting our I's and crossing our T's and making sure that everybody around us dots their I's and crosses their T's, that we become calloused and cold and hard, and we don't have a compassion and an attitude of mercy for those that are still trying to grow and still trying to learn and trying to figure things out. And we just have to be careful. Listen, I am not saying that we just let things slide and that we don't, no big deal. That's not what I'm saying. But man, sometimes our attitude is really poor. We're more like the guy with the big stick, right? Banging somebody over the head with it. Listen, the Lord Jesus Christ would be absolutely ready and willing to stand up and say, this is right and this is wrong. But what amazes me about the Lord is when you look at the way that he actually treated publicans and sinners, he was compassionate and he was merciful. Matter of fact, he showed little patience oftentimes with the religious elite that thought they had it all figured out. I know I wish I could lay out this so easy to understand thing that you could see the lines between the things I'm talking about. Because we have to stand. We can't compromise on certain things. But sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves, in our hearts, I'm going to use the word judgment in the way we think about it, not in the way it's used in this context. We are a little judgmental, and we don't show forgiveness and compassion, mercy like we should. We need to be careful. The last thing I want is to be associated with these guys. If you look at the Bible, man, you don't want to be like these guys. You don't want to be like these guys. Be careful. And all this starts inside. I'll just say that too. As with so many things, I don't know what's on the inside, but you do. Your battle is probably going to start there. Right? Your battle is going to start there. And sometimes it's awareness. When you start to think like that, remember these verses. Step back a little bit. Pray about it. Approach it with the wisdom of God. Right? It actually goes on when it talks about these things, judgment, mercy, and faith. It says, these ought ye to have done and not leave the other undone. In other words, the Lord didn't have issue with the fact that they tithed of mint and cumin and dill. He didn't have an issue with that. He says, you should have been having righteous justice. You should have had mercy and compassion. And you should have had faith. And then tithed of your mint and your cumin. How many times, it's so interesting, and for those that haven't been going through this study, it's amazing how many times the Old Testament points out the fact that it is a heart thing. Are you circumcised in heart? Right? It's amazing how much the Bible points that out. He goes on here in this next verse. It's kind of funny. Ye blind guides which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. This doesn't make a lot of sense to us. But from what I've read, my understanding is you think about there were certain things that were unclean for the Jewish people, right? All the way down to like if you, I looked at Grandpa because I know he used to have a motorcycle. If you drove down the road with your mouth open and you swallowed a few flies, those are unclean, okay? Fleas, gnats, flies, things like that. Unclean. From what I've read, what they would do is if they were going to drink something, they would strain it to make sure that they didn't get that gnat or that flea or that bug that was an unclean. Oddly enough, some critters weren't unclean, but you know the kinds I'm talking about. They would strain it. And his example to them, obviously it's an allegory, it's a picture, right? He'd say, you guys are spending so much time straining your tithing of your mint and your cumin and your dill and your that tiny little stuff. It's like you're straining your liquid for that fly, and you get it and you throw that fly away, and then you choke on a camel. Right? It's a big picture. It's like this big flashing sign that says, you're way down here in the weeds, and you're missing the obvious. We would say the elephant in the room, right? Yeah, you worked out all these details over here, but you missed this big flashing sign right in front of you. How could you miss judgment and mercy and faith? But sometimes that's what happens when you get down and you start to think it's about you and what you can do and you being able to do X. I mean, because that's really the Pharisees' problem, if we boil it down. They had come to the place of believing that they could attain, right? So they strain at the gnat and swallow a camel. Verse 25, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones, and are of all uncleanliness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. There's two woes there, but they're very closely related to each other. This first one just kind of deals with this idea. He uses this picture of taking a cup and taking it like a bowl, let's say, and the inside of this cup has been used. Here, I'm going to get gross because I know the kids will like this. You ever seen that cup that you left out accidentally? And maybe it sat outside, but it had some leftover residue of milk or something in it, right? And it sat there for who knows how many weeks. You know, and you finally find it and you bring it back in, and the inside of that thing is nasty. Milk doesn't start out that color. You know what? If you take that thing and you put your hand over the top of it and you get some warm soapy water and you scrub down the outside of that thing, you get all the dirt off of it, you get all the grass off of it, and man, you look at that thing on the outside, it looks really good. You just go fill that sucker up with some orange juice and take a drink of it. Go ahead. But he's using that as a picture to describe what the Pharisees and others, I mean, this didn't stop when the Pharisees died, right? This is a pretty common thing. Listen, you can dress the outside up all you want to, and it can look nice and clean and pretty and sparkly. But you take that first drink out of it and you're going to throw up. Because the inside is nasty. You know, the Lord taught earlier in some of our studies, right? He told them, listen, it isn't what you consume, it isn't what you take in that defiles you. It's what's already in there and comes out. That's another example. Like, you can make the outside look all pretty, but what's on the inside? And I get it. He's talking to lost people here who are trying to polish themselves up and look religious and look great. But one, I don't know who may be sitting in here today that falls in that camp. I mean, I can tell you that there was a stage in my life where absolutely that's actually, I was lost and I was trying to portray myself as not, and I knew it. A lot of people that made false profession may not know it. They're not sure. They're not confident. Listen, I knew it. I knew it. Didn't stop me from doing devotion. Didn't stop me from trying to do things in the church. I knew it. Well, I was trying to make the outside look all pretty, But inside, I was still that bloody, nasty, filthy rag. But listen, even if you're here today and you're saved, you may be redeemed. You may have the blessed assurance we sang about. You won't die and go to hell. But listen, you can act like this still. You can be away from God, and in your heart, you're not what you're supposed to be. You know it. You're off maybe into some sin. You're not following Him. You're not reading. You're not praying. You're not studying. But man, on the outside, here at church on Sunday, at lunch with coworkers, maybe God comes up and you're going to be an active part of that conversation. We can still do the same thing. We need to make sure that we are sincerely serving and following Him. He goes on and he talks about, you need to get the inside cleaned up. The outside will follow. But he tells them, you're also like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and all of all uncleanness. Interestingly enough, this is a passage I haven't really struggled with, but I went ahead and read some different people's thoughts on it, and I don't know, sometimes you're better off not. There are two different opinions on what this is talking about. Sometimes, from a sepulcher perspective, you think about, we would maybe think about a coffin or a tomb. And lots of times they had these boxes where they might bury you and let you decay, and then they would take your bones and they would put them in this smaller box, and it was usually an ornamental box. It was lots of times made out of something that was white and made it look nice. It might be decorated with something. And that's where your bones would be. Outside, it looks like a really beautiful box. But you open it up and it doesn't change what's in it. Inside, it's just a bunch of bones. Now, the other school of thought is that sometimes if, in the Jewish world, if people found something that was dead, they would come along with like lime, and they would cover it with lime. And the purpose was two things. One of them is pretty obvious, like you don't want the dead thing just laying around out there. But from a Jewish perspective, to touch that would make you unclean. And so they would cover it with this white lime. It stood out. It was obvious. You could see it from a distance. You knew what it was. It was white, bright, and from a distance it might look nice and pretty. But if you start to scrape away that lime, you're going to find a dead, decaying body. I don't know which one it was. I tend to lean to the first one. But either way, the concept is the same. Underneath that white, nice, white, clean thing is death and destruction and decay. That's what they're like. These, by the way, how do I say this? Me and you can suspect something like that. But did you know that I can't look at anybody and say, well, you're like a whited sepulcher, and inside you're this or that? We are talking about the one that has the authority and the knowledge of the heart. And he could look at them and say, I know for a fact that you may look all white and pretty on the outside, but you are dead. You are dead. If you're here today and you're lost, it doesn't matter how well you obey your parents. It doesn't matter how great a job you do at work. It doesn't matter how much you help the poor. It doesn't matter how much you come to church. You can do all those things, and the lost world around you might look at you and go, what a good Christian so-and-so. God knows that on the inside, it's just death. You can't hide that from him. You can't ever hide that from him. I think about the verses that deal with you go down to the depths, and he's there. You go up to the heights, and he's there. You can turn the lights out, he's there. He sees right through your charade. Even if you've got everybody in this life. You know what? We may get to eternity and find out that one person we thought, absolutely, they are going to heaven if anybody is. We could be wrong. But He knows. He knows. Outwardly, verse 28, even so, ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within are ye full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Behold, you build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourselves, that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers. How can ye escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them ye shall scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel unto the blood of Zachariah, son of Barachias, who ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to go far enough, we're going to get into the next topic, and I'm going to try, I'll try to not get too far ahead of myself here. This last one that He gives them, and in this one He is going to get really personal, and He is going to actually, I believe, start to get into some prophecy about what's going to happen. Remember, and we'll get into this later, the people He's talking to, 35, little over 35 years separated from the complete and total destruction of Jerusalem. When He says some of these things that He says, and then later starts to mourn over the city, He's mourning over the city because of what's going to happen about 37 years from here. He tells them, ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchre of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. It's interesting to me. The Pharisees recognize that their fathers were wrong. They recognize that their fathers murdered prophets and misused prophets. But they are self-righteous enough to say, well, if we had been there, we wouldn't have done that. How ironic is it that the very people saying that are the ones that are already planning how they can have Christ killed? I use this example so many times. It is burned in my brain, and I know you guys get tired of hearing it. When we went through the book of John, the very people that wanted to crown Him king, by the end of that chapter, wanted to kill Him. And they wanted to kill Him because He told them that they were in bondage to sin. And their answer was, we're not in bondage to any man because we're Abraham's seed. And He said, well, you're more like your father, the devil. What did the prophets that God sent to the nation do? Very similar things. The prophets were sent to call out for them to repent, turn from their wickedness, turn to God, ask forgiveness. And their fathers murdered and beat and jailed them. And they are standing here in this day honoring those prophets. That's the idea you get, that they are honoring those prophets. They're decorating their tombs. They're taking care of their tombs, making sure that their tombs are well cared for. All the while saying, if it was us, we wouldn't have done this to them. And I believe at this point the Lord actually switches over from just talking out and calling out what they've done to prophesying what they are going to do. And He is telling them, you are going to do the exact same thing that your fathers did. And judgment is going to come. not just because of what you were about to do, but because generations and generations did the same thing. He says, wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets. Set aside what they did to Christ. What did they do to James? What did they do to the Apostle Paul? Silas? Some of those guys that traveled with them. Literally, you can see, when you think about when we went through the book of Acts, this verse should ring out. I'm going to send you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge and persecute from city to city. I seem to recall a time where Paul was in a city and things got so bad he had to leave, and the other city he went to received him and things were going well, and the people that had chased him out of the other city had to go to that city and chase him out of there too. I seem to remember him being beaten, scourged, left for dead. Listen, the Lord didn't only prophesy about his own destruction. He did that a few chapters ago. I think he's calling out here, listen, I know what's in your hearts. You can sit here and tell everybody you wouldn't have done this to God's prophets, but you're on the doorstep of doing it. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. Now as we get into this next part, and we're a little early here, but I hesitate to keep going because this next section is going to take a little bit of time. What I do want to do, I think what we'll do, I'm going to go ahead and read the last few verses of Matthew 23 and the first couple verses of Matthew chapter 24, just to set the stage for what we'll talk about next week, Lord willing. Think about these things, okay? I'm going to give you the summary, and in giving the summary, I'm kind of going to preach it. But I just want you to know what it is, and then we'll come back and talk about it in a little bit more detail. The Lord has just described how the Pharisees are going to kill, beat, and persecute God's people, all whilst claiming to be doing it for God. And God calls judgment on them. And it seems as if either at this moment or shortly thereafter, the Lord looks around and, knowing what is coming, sorrows over the city. Because listen, he knows judgment's coming. In AD 70, Titus is going to not only siege, the siege actually started before AD 70, but in 70 he breaks through and he destroys the temple and he destroys the city. And hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people are killed, and those that aren't killed are sold into slavery. The studying that I've done and the reading and the history, there are literally so many. It's written in some of the history that at this period after AD 70, that there are literally so many Jewish slaves that you could buy a Jewish slave for less than a horse. Literally, they killed hundreds of thousands of them, and the rest they sold to slavery into mines or other kinds of slavery. And like I said, from what I've read, it flooded the market, so to speak. I hate to even speak in those terms. But to show you the complete desolation that the city suffered. Think about that as we read these verses, and then we'll close. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how oft would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. He looks over the multitudes, he looks over the city, and he cries out, yes, they were guilty. Yes, they deserved judgment. But even in the midst of that, he says, how many times would I have taken you in if you had just come? The Lord is long-suffering. And it's this picture, when you read back over it, how many times he sent prophets. How many times he sent somebody saying, you are not where you should be. Just turn and I will forgive you. But you wouldn't. Listen, I'm going to give you something really practical. If you're here today and you are wrapped up in sin, and we all sin, that's not what I'm saying. But if you are actively pursuing something in your life that you know is sin, the temptation might be to say, well, I've gotten away with it so far. Punishment hasn't been too bad. But listen, the Lord might be pricking you, and he might be giving you opportunity to turn. He may be calling you to say, come under the protection of my wings. But you need to understand that he will deal with all sin at some point. And there will come a day when he says, I called and I would have protected, but you wouldn't come. And judgment will hit you. And all of that payment that you owe is going to come due. It's easy to think, well, it hasn't happened. Maybe it'll never find out. Maybe it'll be okay. But listen, God may just be being long-suffering with you. And there's coming a time when his call is over. I'm not talking about lost, saved. The Lord's going to save you. He's going to keep calling you, and you will come. That's just where I fall on that, okay? But I do think from a judgment perspective, there is a time when he gives us time to repent. He gives us time to turn. He gives us time to ask for forgiveness and to come to him for help. And sometimes we become cold and hard-hearted and think we're getting away with it. But it won't. This generation, the generation that he was speaking to, is about to run out of time. And I speak of that not just in regards to them personally, but as a nation. They have reached the point where God is about to say, I'm done. The start has actually already happened at this point. But Jesus looks ahead and says, oh, Jerusalem, I called, and if you would have come, I'd have taken you in. And he leaves them with this thought before then later telling his disciples alone, I think, about the temple not even having a stone left on itself. He looked at Jerusalem and he said, your house is returned unto you desolate. When judgment is done, you'll be wiped clean like a dish. Right? next week, Lord willing, unless the Lord leads some other way, the plan would be is to talk a little bit more about that prophecy about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. We'll talk about these verses, go into a little bit more depth, and then we'll do a little bit of a history lesson, and we'll talk a little bit about the actual destruction of Jerusalem. And we'll see just how detailed Christ was in his description of what would happen. Okay? All right, appreciate your patience today. We're going to go ahead and be dismissed. Brother Philip, would you go ahead? I'll tell you what, I was contemplating whether we sing a song or not. Let's go ahead. Brother Philip, would you come and lead us in a song, please?